from a distance without any romanticization. There are several layers of problems that emerge once we start mapping out its sustainability. Not just how many calories are available, but how social, epidemiological, psychological, and ecological dynamics change that simple calculation. First, the impossibility of scaling. Taking the total number of calories in the population and dividing them into rations per person assumes that all of those calories can be accessed, processed, stored, and distributed. In reality, human corpses don't appear in large quantities all at once unless there's a catastrophe that kills many simultaneously. And such a catastrophe often destroys infrastructure, including cold storage, processing facilities, and remaining labor. Without the ability to maintain a cold chain or safe preservation techniques, meat spoils quickly. That spoilage invites pathogens and toxins that render it inedible. So, while the theoretical calorie count is high, the number of calories that are actually edible, safe, and nutritious is much, much lower. Second, diseases that don't show up at first. We've already touched on the danger of infection, bacteria, viruses, parasites. But there's another category that makes this scenario nearly impossible biologically: prion diseases. These aren't ordinary bacteria or viruses. Prions are misfolded proteins that can cause progressive brain degeneration if consumed. Prion diseases like Kuru once appeared in communities that practiced funeral rituals involving the consumption of brain tissue. Incubation could last years, and the result was fatal. In a community depending on human bodies as food, the accumulation of long incubation diseases means a latent outbreak that slowly wipes out the population, often without obvious signs until it's too late. Even if you avoid certain body parts, prions can spread. They can't simply be cooked out or easily neutralized. Third, law and social norms collapse, and that has consequences. Cannibalism is not just an act of eating. It tears apart the web of trust, rituals, and laws that keep society stable. When those norms vanish, adaptation isn't just about food. Humans turn into predators against one another. Reproductive relations, division of labor, even care for children and the elderly break down. In population models, reproductive function and child rearing can't be ignored. If fear and hostility increase, effective fertility, the number of children raised to adulthood, collapses. So even if calories exist, the ability of society to regenerate itself declines. Long-term survival fractures. Fourth, collective psychology and trauma. The consumption of human remains, especially if carried out systematically, leaves severe psychological damage on participants and witnesses. Post-traumatic stress, mass depression, and cognitive dissociation spread. Humans aren't just calorie processing machines. Mental stability and social bonds are just as essential for maintaining economic and reproductive cooperation. When trauma becomes endemic, a community's ability to coordinate, farming, caregiving, maintaining infrastructure, breaks down. In real-world models, the survival of one individual for a few months is not the same as the survival of civilization. Fifth, the choice of who gets eaten encapsulates moral and practical dilemmas. Will people choose to eat the elderly, the sick, or the unproductive? Such choices affect future social structures, eliminating certain age groups. For example, erases traditional knowledge, technical skills, and childcare, all of which shorten the survival horizon of the next generation. Furthermore, any system attempting to regulate who is eaten, with some criteria of fairness, would require an authority trusted by the group. Ironically, no such authority is nearly impossible to sustain after moral norms have been torn apart. Sixth, alternatives reduce the need for the practice. In a post-apocalyptic scenario, extreme enough for cannibalism to even be considered, there are often alternatives that are practically more viable: maximizing wild plant resources, restoring small-scale farming, hunting wildlife, or even harvesting insects that are abundant in calories and protein. While one might think of the human body as a large calorie reservoir, the energy value relative to effort and risk, disease, retaliation, social disintegration, usually makes alternatives more attractive. Even in harsh conditions, humans find creative ways to harvest safer energy. For instance, gathering tuber plants, cultivating small crops, or harvesting biomass that's easier to process. Seventh, mathematical dynamics favor violence. We can model cyclical cannibalism like a tournament-style elimination game. That's right. If each month half the population eats the other half, the survivors decrease exponentially until biology, disease, skill loss, and social anarchy take over. A simple model estimates a few dozen months as the practical limit of this behavior. More realistic models, which add in factors like prion diseases, fertility decline, and infrastructure collapse, give us a far shorter timeline. Perhaps only a few months before communities splinter into small groups, no longer capable of sustaining productive labor. Finally, moral and philosophical questions can't be ignored. How much viable life is worth sustaining at the cost of the dignity and values that define humanity? If the abstract goal is merely species survival, rather than the preservation of meaningful life, our choices would look different. But most of us don't just value survival in raw numbers. We value quality of life. Keeping humans alive as beating organisms is not the sole moral endpoint. Relationships, art, knowledge, and ethics are part of what make human life worth living. So, even if the calorie numbers look sufficient on paper, the field answer remains the same. This is a bad idea. So returning to Quinn's question, how long could humanity survive on cannibalism alone? The answer, in the narrowest technical sense, is perhaps long enough for a handful of individuals to survive for a few months to a few years under highly controlled conditions. And even then, with the risk of total quality of life collapse and latent outbreaks. In practical and moral terms, the answer is almost certainly not long, and it's not a solution. It's a gateway to biological and social collapse. It's far better to think about how to preserve knowledge, decentralized food systems, and networks of cooperation, not about reducing human beings into a food supply chain.